So it's been about a year since I bought my M1 Mac Mini. This little guy has been my main driver for the past year. In this video, I'm going to talk about why this is the best computer I've ever owned. Let's get into it. Last year, when it became very apparent that I wasn't returning to the office anytime soon, I began to upgrade my home office. So I upgraded my desk, peripherals, monitor, audio, video, lighting. But the biggest upgrade that I did came in a small little package, the M1 Mac Mini. This M1 Mac Mini basically was replacing my 2017 MacBook Pro. My name is Patrick, and this is Everyday tech for everyday people. And before I go on, let me tell you the specs of this particular machine I got, and tell you some of the accessories I bought for it. Now, I'm not going to mention about monitors, keyboard, mice, because these are accessories that every computer needs. But let me tell you about the accessories I bought to make up for some of the shortcomings of this machine. So here are the specs for the M1 Mac Mini that I got. I got the M1 Mac Mini with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 SSD, or 512 gigabytes of SSD storage. Now I went with 16 gigabytes of RAM because I wanted to make this M1 Mac Mini last as long as possible, and 16 gigabytes is the most you can get for an M1 Mac Mini or an M1 Mac without the Pro or Max badge attached to it. Then I went with 512 gigabytes of storage because that's plenty enough for me to store all the applications I run. But to make up for the storage, the first accessory that I got was the Samsung T7 SSD. I got 500 gigabytes of storage there. And so I have a total of 1 terabyte of storage. One of the things that people complain about are the lack of ports from these past couple years of Macs. Now this M1 Mac Mini has 2 Thunderbolt USB 4 ports, 2 USB-A ports, an Ethernet jack, an HDMI port. Oh yeah, and don't forget about the audio jack. Now I would argue that for most people, this is more than enough ports. But of course, I'm not like most people. I pretty much have used all the ports here. So I went with the CalDigit TS3 Plus dock, which gives me more than enough ports. So between the Samsung T7 SSD drive and the CalDigit TS3 Plus dock, I'm pretty much all set. I'm not here to talk about these accessories. I'm here to talk about my experience using this machine for the past year. If I were to describe in one word my experience with this M1 Mac Mini, I would say snappy. Everything is just snappy. All applications just loads like very snappy or snappier. Even when using these applications, it's just very snappy. And especially with those applications that are optimized for the M1 Mac Mini or the M1 chip, it's really just everything loads lightning quick. And even those applications that are not yet optimized, they load just as fast as I had before. So everything is just very snappy. Now the one application or type of application I use the most is web browsing. So I use both Chrome and Safari. Of course, Safari is like native to the M1 Macs, but Chrome shortly came out with an update to their Chrome browser that is M1 native as well. And I would say, wow, web browsing, all these things, all these web pages that took a little bit of time to load before, just kind of load almost like in an instant. So the biggest test that I had when I first got it was Gmail. And Gmail does take some time usually to load. And I was just amazed how fast it loaded. It was just really, again, snappy. Now in my 1 month review of the Mac Mini, I talked about productivity apps and how some of them were not optimized for the M1 chips yet, but they worked very well. Well, I'm happy to say that they work even better now because a lot of the Office suites, like the Microsoft Office suite, has been optimized for the M1 chips. And then other things like Photoshop, Lightroom, all these things have been now optimized for the M1 chips. So now I would say my experience as far as applications are concerned have been getting better and better. And another application I use mainly for programming is Microsoft's VS Code. And I'm happy to say that's also optimized for the M1 chip. Now, there are other applications that I use on a regular basis, like OBS, that are still Intel based. But because of Rosetta 2, and because it works so well, I haven't seen any lag, and I'm able to stream, record using OBS with no issues, even though it's not optimized. So let's talk about some of the issues I've had with the M1 Mac Mini in the past year. Now, in my 1 month review, I talked about some Bluetooth issues I was having. Occasionally it would disconnect, different things, or even like the mouse would lag a bit, the keyboard would lag a bit. Well, I'm happy to say that for the most part, those issues have been fixed. Now, occasionally, I still do get some issues with the keyboard lagging or falling behind a little bit. So that's why I do have a cable that I can plug into it directly into the computer. This particular keyboard has both Bluetooth and USB as far as the interface is concerned. But for the most part, those issues have been fixed. Now I am running Mac OS Monterey now, and that has seemed to stabilize the OS even more. When I first bought the M1 Mac Mini, it was at Big Sur, Mac OS 11, and now we're at Monterey version 12, and I'm running 12.0.1 as at the time of this review. Now, the other issue that I found was occasionally the computer would reboot when I put it to sleep. Now, as of Mac OS Monterey, and I don't know when they fixed this issue, but I haven't seen the reboot issue anymore. So I'm happy to say that's been fixed as well. Another little issue I ran into is some software incompatibility. Well, in particular with plugins. So I use Final Cut Pro as my main video editor, and I was using a plugin by Pixel Film Studios, their tracking software, and initially it wasn't compatible with the M1 chips. Later on, they did do an update to that plugin, but the implementation of that plugin is a little wonky. But I'm happy to say that Apple came out with their own update to Final Cut Pro, and they have their built-in tracking in Final Cut Pro now. And so check out my Final Cut Pro 10.6 update here. And that's pretty much the story of software. It's just been getting better and better as companies start to update their pieces of software to make them M1 compatible. Now, those pieces of software that are not yet M1 compatible yet, well, they've been running just fine and pretty darn fast. And those are just going to get better and better as the companies update to the new M1 chip. Now, obviously, I'm happy with my past year experience with this M1 Mac Mini. In my 1 month review, I called it the best valued Mac. I would argue that this is one of the best valued computers, period. Now, some people would argue, what about equivalent or cheaper Windows machines? I would argue you won't be able to find an equivalent Windows machine here. Now, when Apple was running on Intel, the comparisons were more fair then. You had more choices, especially on a PC side. But now with these M1 chips, the game has changed. The M1 chip has made everything so much quicker, so much more optimized. The need for more RAM is not as important. Depends on, of course, it depends on your application now. Depends on the tools and what's important to you. Now, I do wish that I could do more expansion as far as my Mac Mini here, like you can do like on a desktop PC, but those are depending on the things that you value the most to you. Now, would I recommend buying this M1 Mac Mini now, a year later that it's been released? I would say it depends. Now, if you really need a computer and you're just kind of stuck, I wouldn't hesitate to buy it, but I wouldn't buy it at full price. There are definitely deals out there now, and even Apple's own site, the refurbished section of their store, I wouldn't hesitate to buy one of those machines as well. Now, do you agree with my 1 year review here? Has this been your experience? Those of you with the M1 Mac Mini, what's your experience been like? Leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider subscribing. Until the next one, see ya.